Tio Nigara, Aya Jijata Dagwadoa, Jalagia Yetli, Gwena Sa'i, Echoda Galski Golski. So my name is Jeff Corntassel. I'm from the Cherokee Nation, Wolf Clan, and my parents are Gene and Gary, living in Anaheim, and I'm proud to be here on Lekwungen territory and Wasanich territory for today's talk.
What does Indigenous law mean to you?
I think law has so many different connotations, and for me, that law is what grounds us to the earth and those relationships we have with our territories, with the animals, with the plants. And so I guess for me, when we think of Indigenous law, it's about kind of reaffirming and honoring those relationships and nurturing those relationships that we have in terms of our governance structures, in terms of our family structures, in terms of those future generations that we're working with. Yeah, I think a lot of my work is focused these days on restoration of our land-based practices, our water-based practices, whatever that entails. So a lot of times for some communities it's about reintroducing plants, and some of the work that I do here with Cheryl Bryce, for example, is about pulling invasive species and helping with that process, but also revitalizing the camas or the quetlal, which is kind of the staple food out here. In my own territory, it's about growing those things, again, that nurture us, tobacco, right, corn. And so we have a Cherokee Heirloom Seed Project where folks from even outside the territory can grow those things. And the whole goal is to kind of replenish the seed supply for future generations. So, yeah, I think it comes down to, in a sense, we could talk about legal avenues and ways of knowing, but it comes down to how do we sustain ourselves as nations, as peoples, as families, and what are those things that we're coming up against? Colonialism, ongoing colonization, these forms of encroachment into our everyday lives that make things difficult, in some cases impossible, right, or seemingly impossible to have a presence on the land and on the water. So it's those everyday battles or those everyday struggles that I look at a lot these days. What are the everyday forms of resurgence that people engage in that aren't necessarily in the newspaper, that aren't necessarily publicized, that are kind of hidden from view? That could be anything from speaking the language, fatherhood. I've got an 8-year-old daughter, right? I think of those everyday interactions for me are about promoting Shalagi values and practices, but also honoring those relationships so that Leela will know, right, who she's accountable to, and even what she's restoring, right, or reclaiming as a Cherokee woman. So a lot of my work is on resurgence and kind of different ways of sustaining self-determination. Yeah.
Can you speak to ways of teaching Indigenous law?
The importance of teaching it is about remembering those values and acting on those values that come out of our stories, that come out of the land and those relationships to the land. So, when I think of like being a Cherokee out here on Lekwungen territory, it's a little bit tricky, but it's about learning the stories of this place and honoring the protocols and the practices of this place, while at the same time carrying, in a sense, those community values with me. And so in terms of teaching, for me, there's no substitute to kind of land-based pedagogy, land-based or water-based teaching, right? Getting people out on the land and having that direct experiential kind of knowledge, or someone with a direct experiential knowledge, engaging with them and finding ways that they can learn about the plants, what's invasive, what's not, but also what are we restoring? What are we trying to do? And even how to walk on this place, the language of this place, the stories. And so just as I would hope folks would treat traveling to my territory and having those protocols and that respect that's in place. So it's about engaging with that, with the territory, but also with the people of this area, so that here's the ultimate teaching for me is, if folks that are non-native are called Wanitum, or called by these different words, Wanitum basically means, the hungry people or the greedy people. What are we doing to overcome that perception, right? How are we not fulfilling that mentality of a settler? And so as an Indigenous person, it's about having a direct relationship with the people of this place and having a way of being held accountable for the actions that I take. And so all that comes out in the teaching. It's teaching by story, teaching by example. And I think of a Shalagi notion of leadership kind of comes into play, according to Benny Smith, who kind of taught me about this, Cherokee elder. Basically, it starts with a vision that you have as an individual, a dream or a vision, and then you act on it in your everyday life. You have to make it a part of your everyday process, and then you make it relatable to people. So you suddenly have to find ways to make it relevant to everyone around you, and then you mobilize people for change. So it's a process that it's kind of like radiating responsibilities that Leanne Simpson talks about. It's a process of starting with that individual and radiating out to make change and to reclaim our territories.
How can non-Indigenous people learn about the Indigenous laws of where they live?
Yeah, this is something I've thought a lot about, and I think folks have an obligation when they move to a different territory to understand and have a relationship with the people of that territory. It may not always be a friendly relationship. It may be a relationship of discomfort, but it's something. It's a starting point. And trying to think about living with the people of this territory versus living on the land, right? And treating the land as a commodity or treating the land as another product. So I like the idea that comes out of Australia. A lot of Indigenous folks started issuing passports in Western Australia to people that were looking for asylum in the country. And so when Australia denied them asylum, the Indigenous people said, okay, we'll grant you asylum, we'll grant you a passport to our territory, but you've got to make a vow to protect our territory and help protect the land. And so I like those kinds of innovations when thinking about Indigenous law and kind of our approaches to settlers, the settler problem, I guess it's another way to refer to it. And other ways that are apparent, come out of even the recent recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right, about education and how do we educate. I saw this phrase, educate to perpetuate. But what are we perpetuating, right, through education? I think as Indigenous peoples, we're perpetuating our cultures, we're perpetuating our language. But we want to avoid perpetuating myths and stereotypes and colonial mentalities in mainstream classrooms. So finding ways to, I call it insurgent education, finding ways to make people uncomfortable at times through truth-telling, through different, ways of retelling or reminding them of history and where they're sitting and the long history of this place, to making towards reasserting self-determining authority by reclaiming spaces and reclaiming names. Pakals is just one of many examples of reclaiming the place name of what is known as Mount Douglas, right? So finding ways to get people's attention to say that the landscape that we live on is constantly, it reflects the Indigenous peoples of this territory, but through a constant state of almost erasure and through a constant denial of our peoplehood, folks diminish that, and they diminish our self-determining authority by not recognizing it. So it's finding ways to show that we're still here and that we still have a strong presence on the land and on the water, and that these relationships aren't going away. They're being sustained in our everyday practice.
How are gender, sexuality, and Indigenous law related?
I think it's crucial, and I think how we understand even resurgence, Indigenous resurgence, how we understand what we're restoring. If we don't understand what we're restoring in terms of our roles and responsibilities as Indigenous peoples, and if we don't have in a sense, if we don't allow it to evolve, but also to reinterpret how those traditions are perceived, we can, I think, unknowingly or sometimes consciously reproduce colonial values and reproduce colonial systems. So I think of gender as really a key area for understanding how our relationships are grounded, and getting beyond a gender binary, right? Getting beyond just a male-female understanding, right? As Cherokees, we had other notions of gender that go far beyond those binaries, and so avoiding the reproduction of those, but also knowing or reminding people that those roles and responsibilities have never been so rigid, right? So over time I've seen, like in my own nation, kind of a more rigid approach to gender roles and responsibilities that doesn't really reflect, I think, a lot of our traditional practices. And so it's challenging people. It's challenging to do this, right? Because you become, criticized by folks in your own community, even by folks that are elders, by other knowledge keepers, by other people in political authority. But we have to understand, as Cherokees, the clan mothers were a foundational part of our governance system. And the clan mothers are no longer in that same prominent role that they were, I'd say, even 200 years ago. And so we have to find ways to bring people's attention to that, but also in doing that, we have to restore our clan systems, and we have to understand that, a crucial part of our governance and a crucial part of law is understanding how those roles and responsibilities interrelate. And so, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think and I don't promise to have any solutions. It's a difficult process of having these uncomfortable conversations, but understanding that the implications of not having these conversations is devastating, right? We're talking about violence against women, against girls, right? We're talking about violence against transgendered people. We're talking about violence against a lot of other groups that are, two-spirited, however we want to refer to folks, that is often ignored or marginalized. And so in doing that, we're marginalizing folks from the discussion. And there's a Cherokee notion of gadugi, which is kind of this notion of no one person is left to struggle in life on their own. No one person is left to an endeavor alone. And so it's about community camaraderie. And if we're truly practicing gadugi, we can't ignore or leave out anyone in our community. We have to understand how to live as a community again. And so I think we've forgotten some of those things along the way. And so if we're going to use the word gadugi, if we're going to use the word tohi, all these different words that relate to our governance, we have to know the full implications of them. And that means understanding the role of gendered relationships in our community, and also the role of colonization and how that's altered or distorted those roles and responsibilities today.
How can we address homophobia and sexism within Indigenous law?
There's a need for new stories. There's a need for new stories to relate our teachings to those responsibilities that we have today. And so I don't know what those always look like, but we have to, even if the teachings don't seem to be there, we do have our community consciousness, and we have our land-based consciousness. So those methods or those ways of interacting come from the land, come from the water. And so I think over time they're gonna come from our dreams. They're gonna come from individuals taking leadership. There was a former student of ours, Chawinnis, who's from Tloquiat in New Channel, and she did a march against violence. But she did it in a slightly different way. She did it in a culturally kind of relevant way to her community. And she held up 15 different women in 15 different communities at their coming of age ceremony. And so she walked through with several people to each of these communities. In doing that, she basically said, the violence has got to stop. And this is not our tradition. So sometimes it's reminding people of the traditions that we have. And sometimes it's in a sense, creating new traditions about how we value and respect people. And because we all have teachings about the sacredness of life. We all have teachings, I think, about the importance of honoring our relationships. And so you take those and you can reinterpret those, you can re-expand those. And I think the answer comes from our legal tradition, so to speak, from our governance itself. Our governance, it was inclusive and is inclusive. And so it's finding ways to remind people of those things, but also to reinvigorate some of those things that have meaning and continue to foster the kind of relationship building.
How can we take on tough questions within our communities?
This is really a tough one, I think, and it gets to the question of how do we confront colonial mentalities in our own communities? And, do you meet people where they're at, or do you kind of take a leadership role? How do you navigate that? And I don't have any easy answers. It's messy, but I think, when it comes to things like homophobia, racism, right, other things like that, we have to address it head on. When it comes to even demeaning other people, when it comes to even demeaning our ceremonies, we have to address it head on. And so I say that because the Cherokee Nation has a long history of Christianity, right? And so that influence is there, and it sometimes muddies the picture in terms of what is traditional. And so we have to confront it, even if it means getting alienated at times. And we have to find ways to have these conversations. I think a lot of folks in Cherokee Nation, for example, would hesitate to have any discussion around Indigenous feminism if we couched it that way. But if we said, let's have a discussion about clan mothers and governance, then we can have a conversation which gives an opportunity for those deeper conversations. So I think we have to find ways to confront those mentalities, but also to bring youth into the discussion as well. So our youth have to be seen as vital participants, and I think a lot of youth are kind of alienated from current leadership. They're alienated from older generations that don't appear to live out the values that they espouse. And so I think a lot of youth are looking for real leadership, and they're embodying it in a lot of cases, whether it's through sexual health and education, whether it's through reclaiming territory. So I think we have to bring those elders and youth together in ways that haven't been done before. And in a sense, I'm out to eradicate the nuclear family, because I think that nuclear family is a myth. And so I'm trying to find ways to have those conversations about what does it mean to have an extended family, and what are the implications even for questions like sustainability. And so I think you can have, when you bring in the word sustainability, people think, oh, we're talking about the environment. And then you can flip it on them and say, we're actually talking about families, and we're talking about values, and we're talking about gendered relations. That's the only way we can think about sustainability meaningfully. And so we have to have a wider participation, I think, in our communities. Another way I think that the late Vine Deloria Jr. talked about it was bringing, and other people have mentioned this as well, finding ways to bring people back to the community through ceremony. So a way of recognizing coming of age, right, which is an important part of, I think, a lot of our communities, but also recognizing a coming back to the community if you've been in an urban area, or if you've been exiled in a sense from the community for no reason of your own, right? You've been pushed off the land, or you've been encroached upon. So finding innovative ways to, in a sense, renew those commitments to people that are living maybe outside of our territories, and bringing them into the discussion as well. Yeah, I struggle with that as well, kind of the neoliberal paradigm, right, of development, and how that's really influenced a lot of our community's decision making. We have Robert's Rules of Order in Cherokee Nation. We have all these different things in the council, right? And so I see these kinship values being displaced sometimes by neoliberal or commodified values, and I'm sometimes one of the few people that thinks that way, because a lot of folks will say, hey, we need jobs, we need opportunities, economic development is the way to the future. And so I'm finding myself constantly reminding folks that, what I'm proposing for Indigenous governance is not kind of going back to a time of pre-contact. We're not, that's not what we're talking about. But we are talking about different ways of living on the land that reflect our values and our systems. So it's not to say that we don't have jobs, but I don't go as far as Clarence Louis to say that jobs are the new form of hunting. So I think I really emphasize these days Indigenous economies. And our Indigenous economies are grounded in place, but they're also grounded in kind of a notion of gifting economy. They're grounded in our values of generosity. They're grounded in diplomatic relationships with other nations. And so when I think of what best exemplifies that, these days I think of inter-Indigenous treaty making or diplomacies. For example, the Bison Treaty of 2014 was basically a treaty signed by other Blackfeet nations on both sides of the U.S. and Canadian border that reaffirmed the centrality of bison in their culture, but also the need to protect bison and to honor that relationship. And so this gets beyond kind of just rhetorical notions of Indigenous economies to something that's grounded and real. And I've seen other innovations like like having a Maza coin kind of structure in Songhees, for example, and other nations. I think we have to look to alternatives to the current system, and finding out what really drove our Indigenous economies in places like in Aymara territory and other places. It's the women, and I think the women drive a lot of the economies here as well. And whatever that looks like, it's trading Quetlal, it's the weaving economy. We can think of all sorts of different forms of that economy that are grounded in our values, but also allow us to perpetuate our cultural practices and our land-based practices. So there's no easy answer to this. We're enmeshed in this political economy, whether we like it or not, in some form or fashion. Just even the clothes that I'm wearing, the cell phones that we have reflect that, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't make decisions that influence what we're going to uphold and how we're going to, in a sense, work for our community and direct that energy. If you think of money as energy, direct that energy towards new possibilities. Whether it could be, different types of seed banks, whether it could be different kinds of community gardens, food programs. I think of food sovereignty a lot when I think of Indigenous economies. So promoting that notion of being able to feed ourselves. And that can be done through hunting and fishing out here on the West Coast. Even with depleted supplies, we still think of those values, the first fish ceremony, first salmon ceremony, as guiding our overall interaction. So Nick Claxton from SEAD is doing some really important work on revitalizing the reef net fisheries out here. And so there's all sorts of possibilities of reclaiming fishing spots, but also signing new treaties with basically Wasanich people on the other side of the U.S. border, like Lummi Nation. So those possibilities are in play and are definite things that can be pursued. And I think we have to get innovative. We're innovative people, and we have to get innovative about what kind of futures we want for our kids. That, you know, if we take the message of the Harper regime, it's that Indigenous kids are just the new workforce. And if that's really what we're going to accept, we're going to have a whole different vision of community than if we create opportunities for our kids that are going to look different from that vision.
Can you explain the relationship between colonialism and neoliberalism?
Yeah, I think in terms of distinguishing or showing the overlap between colonization and neoliberalism, I think of colonization as that form of displacement grounded by imperial values of Indigenous peoples from their lands. It's a form of encroachment into our everyday lives. It's disbanding families. It's, in a sense, trying to erase our presence on the land and on the water. And so neoliberalism dovetails with that in the sense that it attempts to marketize our citizenship, it attempts to marketize our relationships into commodities, into things that are valued by the capitalist system. And in doing that, it suddenly shifts your loyalties. Your loyalty is no longer to promoting the community. In a sense, it's shifting it to a more competitive system where you're rooting for people to fail so that you can succeed on the backs of their failure. And so in that sense, I see neoliberalism as counter to a more cooperative system or a consensus-driven system where you're rooting for everyone's success. And so just to boil it down to real simple terms, it's neoliberalism is, I think at its essence, is about kind of individualism and predatory actions and making us into marketized citizens.
What are some big issues you're looking at these days?
Some of the things that we're confronting in Cherokee, but also in other communities, is disenrolling people or taking people off the rolls, and even looking into different forms of banishment, right? So kicking people out of community, which is deemed traditional on one level, but on another level, the way it's played out, it's been families that have long-standing feuds with each other, and so they're using that influence to basically kick people off. And so disenrollments in the states, for example, from Indigenous communities our nations have risen to just under 10,000 in the last 5-6 years, right? So it's become a real problem, and it's gendered as well, in the sense that it's usually women who are confronting the authorities or the powers that be in band council and chiefs, and they're the ones getting marginalized or sometimes kicked out of the community. So I think we have to look at that, I guess what we talked about before, what is this self-determining authority? How is that going to be used in community? And how is it promoting these community values? If it's merely to advantage one group over another, again, we have systems that we need to rethink, we need to reinterpret them because they're not working. And so I think that speaks to governance in general. We have to think of new forms of leadership that reflect our values, and that's where the stories of the land and those relationships come through. And so I think there's a lot of potential there. It's just right now it's a bit frustrating to see, and this happens throughout the Americas, right? To see this kind of division, the old divide and conquer mentality played out in our own communities. And it plays out in Mapuche communities in Chile, it plays out in Mayan communities in Mexico and Guatemala. It plays out in so many different ways, and it's usually orchestrated by state powers. It's orchestrated by colonial entities, whether it's multinational corporations or other non-governmental organizations. So I think we have to confront that assault on our values, and we have to promote our dignity as Indigenous peoples and promote our self-determining authority to the degree that it's promoting community and nationhood and reflects those values. Yeah.